Most of us have a connection to divorce. Maybe your parents had a divorce, or you're supporting a friend through a marriage breakdown, or perhaps you've been through one or more yourself. The narrative around divorces is always sad and painful and messy. But photographer Harry Borden illustrates the ripple effect that the breakdown of marriage creates, including the positive outcomes of peace, reflection, and recreation of one's self in his book on divorce. A combination of visual portrait and written self-portrait. It kind of contemplates the end of marriage by presenting photographs with reflections on divorce from his subjects. Harry, welcome to you.
Hello.
What is it about our interpersonal relationships and family dynamics, like divorce, that interest you?
My sort of story really was one of the first 20 years of my life. I've always been a photographer. I guess I've never had a proper job, and I sort of dedicated my time to photographing famous people. And in fact, it just occurred to me that not only is my wife, my ex-wife, Australian, but I photographed Michael Hutchinson and the pictures in the Australian Portrait Gallery. And I've gone off on a bit of a tangent, but
Wow.
basically what happened was I sort of photographed all these famous people, and I got to the point in my life where the wheels kind of came off with me getting divorced, and suddenly, everything had gone perfect up until that point. And then suddenly, we moved out of town, and we sort of, for our kids, and for once in my life, things weren't going according to plan. And it sort of actually ended up being a catalyst of various projects which were more personal in nature. And so that's where this kind of interest came. I mean, it's really summed up in the get lemons, make lemonade sort of adage, really. I kind of just thought, I felt it's been 15 years since we got divorced, but it was kind of one of the biggest and most emotional experiences of my life. And so it seemed natural to sort of explore that in my work.
So were you looking for a way to sort of self-soothe? You mentioned it was 15 years ago. I mean, surely these wounds can linger that long and longer. Or are you trying to find the perfect divorce, to canvass people's experiences to find out the best possible way to have a divorce?
The best way to win my ex back because she wanted to be with someone else, or get on with my life and be happy, have a good relationship with my children. It was the same path, and I realized that was one of reconciliation and sort of dismantling the ego. That the best way to sort of move forward was to sort of accept the situation and sort of listen to her. And out of that, I realized that most people don't do that. And so almost immediately, because I took that approach, my ex and I a friendship started to blossom, and we started to get on really well. And we basically approached a law firm and asked if they could represent us both, because we didn't want an adversarial sort of approach, because we were both united in commitment to our kids being okay and it being not impacting on them in a corrosive way. And I found that it was just impossible. And so we sort of went back and we got divorced online, and it was a really kind of quite civilized experience. The best way to kind of have a good life is to sort of not obsess about the past and sort of try and rework these sort of unsatisfactory relationships, sort of actually recontextualize them as, we were in love and we had 3 children and it was a beautiful relationship in many ways, but not everything lasts. I mean, literally nothing lasts. Everything changes, everything's constantly in flux, and it's important to kind of embrace that. And I think that's probably where so many people go wrong when they do get divorced.
In the beginning of the book, you have some thoughts about how divorce occurs, and you make the comparison between lovers and babies. Talk to me about this comparison.
The book is published by the School of Life, which is a sort of an organisation that was founded by Alain de Botton, the writer. And it would be wrong of me to take credit for his beautifully written essay, because he wrote the essay at the beginning. But I mean, I think as and a relationship evolves, I think what he's sort of getting at is the fact that, initially you're kind of blinded by, the priorities that you have when you're usually in your 20s and you're young, which is you're looking for a mate which is sort of genetically compatible to you. So your criteria for what you find attractive changes over time. And once you get to sort of, once you've had children and once you're older, then you kind of no longer shackled, as George Melly said, to sort of your kind of sexual desire, and you can kind of actually find someone who, you obviously you might be sex. It's nice. Sex is important. It's important to be desirous of your partner, but that's not the only thing. You need to kind of mutual support and humor and all these other elements that come into the relationship, which are kind of more are set aside, I think, when people are young and looking for a mate in order to sort of have children in a sort of quite animalistic way.
You believe that a portrait is a record of the relationship that you have with the person. So, how did you want these portraits to tell these stories? Because as you've outlined, certainly in your own private experience, there can be bitterness and heartbreak, but then there can be another transition into something more functional and then eventually friendship. So when you take a momentary portrait of these couples, it has to be in one of those transitions or phases. So how did you approach that?
Yeah, it can be challenging. I think what I do is when I start a project, I always ask myself two questions: how do I feel about this subject, and what am I trying to say? And I think also it's important. It gives you an advantage anyway. I think people should be able to do projects about whatever they want, and even if it's something they don't have personal experience of. But setting that aside, I think if the fact that I went through it myself gave me sort of the authority or the compassion and the empathy to sort of talk to people. And obviously they were in various states of getting divorced. So some people were absolutely in the maelstrom of and very, very emotionally raw and still in the middle of it. And some people were more sort of sanguine and able to start. Most people, in fact, had actually quite a positive a take on divorce. But it's also the case that the people that I found for the book, it sort of self-selects for people who were more thoughtful and self-aware and able to sort of talk about it. I mean, I'd imagine people who were really, really angry would be less inclined to sort of be interested in being in the book. But I'd say all the people in the book have become friends. And I just think, I mean, I start from that approach that a portrait is a record of the relationship, because quite often the interesting pictures have portraits for me have sort of intimacy and have a connection quite often. And actually, if it doesn't go well, if you photograph somebody and you don't get on well, then there can be a sort of tension. But it's just a sort of mathematical equation, really, that it literally is, you're capturing time and you're capturing the connection you have with the person. I mean, the most sort of banal and uninteresting portraits to me are just a sort of empty exercise in technique and stamping people with technique, which is very commonplace to have good technique these days with the cameras as they are and the digital sort of shift that we've experienced in the medium. So it's really the interesting thing for me is about that connection, whatever that happens to be on the day.
You have several children of divorce in the book. Your son Florian and his reflection is included. He, at least apparently, chooses to see the positive side in your own divorce. Was that a revealing answer to you?
Yeah, I mean, he actually he couched that. He was positive, but he also sort of pointed out that his mum and I sort of split up very, very quickly. And I think that sort of reflects the fact that we weren't really getting on terribly well, and we kind of hid it from him. But I've got three other children, and they're older, and in fact they were the children of my sort of main marriage that I sort of write about in the book. And then Florian came from a 10-year relationship that happened after that. And I picked Florian because he just is by nature a very extrovert and an extremely good communicator. And I knew that he would have something, although he was only 11 at the time, I knew that he'd have something sage to add. Yeah, I'm just going to say that the one that he did, it did kind of shock myself and his mum that he pointed out that it was so quick, and he'd found that a bit discombobulating, that he suddenly was living in a different house for 50% of the time. But the dust settled, and I think it often can provide children with a sort of blueprint for the real nature of relationships, rather than buying into a sort of romantic notion that you're going to like a Disney-esque kind of fairy tale idea that you're going to find the one.
If you just joined me on RN Drive, photographer Harry Borden is here. We're discussing his new book on divorce. I have to say, Harry, your career seems to have two halves to it, if you like. There's the high-profile celebrity editorial and cover shoots that you talked about, and then there are your sort of private projects that seem to explore almost the antithesis of the rich and famous, the familial or the intimate, like your project Single Dad. The two worlds really collided, didn't they, when at one point you worked with Bob Geldof? Tell me about that.
Well, I actually, yeah, that's true. I mean, I kind of leveraged my I still photographed occasionally celebrities for magazines and so on, but I happened to photograph Sir Bob for The Guardian, and I'd photographed him a couple of times, I think for Time magazine with Bono, something to do with Live Aid, and sort of marking having Live Aid having taken place rather than I was at school when Live Aid actually happened. But because I sort of knew him, I sort of showed him I sort of at the shoot I showed him the pictures that I'd shot of the single parent dads, and he liked the project. And obviously he's an advocate for men, and and a very, very powerful speaker, very articulate and has an interesting take. And so it's one of those things that one can do when you sort of have access to these people, because otherwise it's impossible to sort of get people to agree to do something like that. But he basically, I'll tell you what actually happened. I realized after I'd shot him the second time that I'd photographed Peaches, his daughter, and I've got a daughter, and I just sort of had a lot of compassion for what happened. And so
with the death
I went
of his daughter.
That's right. Yeah. And so I went onto my hard drives and I downloaded all the JPEGs, the photographs that I'd taken of her. I didn't edit them at all. I just basically made some prints and I just put them in an envelope and I sent them to his manager. I'd forgotten about this. And he emailed me and he said, thank you so much for doing that. People don't realize that's all I have, are things like that. And he reminded me about the single parent dads that I'd shown him, and he said, is there anything he could do? And I said, well, seeing as you ask, it'd be great if you could write me an essay about single parent fatherhood. And his essay was brilliant. It was probably a bit too campaigning and a bit too hard for what I wanted. And he kindly rewrote it a couple of times, which he's not used to being told to rewrite it, but he was really, he was so kind, and I've got so much respect for him. It's a very quixotic project. I mean, it's an art book really, in a sort of age where people are quite down on men. It was a kind of celebration of men who are the main carer, and so it wasn't a kind of big publishing phenomenon, but it was kind of him to do that. Similarly, I photographed nearly 200 Holocaust survivors, and I came to Melbourne and on 2 trips and photographed them for my first book, which was a portrait of the survivors of the Holocaust. So I'd photographed Howard Jacobson, and he'd written about the Holocaust, and so I was photographing him for the Sunday Times, so I was able to sort of show him the pictures, and he wrote a foreword for me. So it's nice if that can happen, And in this instance, Alain was happy to. It was part of his. It was a collaboration with him really. This book, so it was great that he wrote that essay because it's so measured and thoughtful. I love what the School of Life do.
In your line of work, and to some extent mine, you don't have a lot of time to get to know a subject, particularly with famous people, politicians, celebrities and such. So I'm curious about what you do in order to sort of see them, to connect with them as fast as possible, because at the end of the day, your career has stemmed from photographing Jimmy Savile and Oscar Pistorius to Bob Geldof and many others. It's a very diverse range of creatures that you photograph. So how do you get to know them quickly?
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting. After I split up with my ex, various things that I did, including sort of a meditation retreat. I did Vipassana meditation, but one of the things I did was go and see a psychologist and sort of get an insight into my sort of where I was at. It was a way of showing her that I was sort of dealing with these things, and the psychologist pointed out that my father, who's no longer with us, was probably a narcissist. But he then sort of made the observation that that was the perfect to have a narcissistic parent is the perfect sort of preparation that you need for dealing with celebrities quite often, because you basically learn to sort of by force of personality sort of bowl into a room and sort of hold their attention. It's exhausting. You probably know you have to kind of hold their attention and be interesting and charismatic and worthy of their time. And so basically I think it's a sort of a personality. I think you have to be sufficiently in control of the medium of photography that you can put that aside and, as I say, work on that connection and actually just try and create something very, very quickly by being interesting and funny and having being hyper vigilant about where they're at. I mean, people love talking about themselves, so quite often it helps that I have a good grasp of popular culture. So if I'm photographing Steve Coogan, I'm a fan of Steve Coogan and I know his.
You can quote
oeuvre.
Alan Partridge to him, sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Or Saxondale, which is a more sort of esoteric project that he was involved in that he was impressed that I knew of. But basically, I definitely don't sort of gem up on the people I'm photographing because that's a bit nerdy, but I try and have an authentic exchange. But I'm kind of interested in people generally. So I just sort of access my inquisitiveness and just sort of ask questions and just concentrate on having an authentic exchange rather than, as I said, stamping them with the photographic technique, which is boring as far as they're concerned.
Well, that technique of yours, that very insightful and sincere and honest technique is very much evident in this latest work. Photographer Harry Borden has been my guest. His book On Divorce is out now.